Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for April 2nd, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, as we prepare to get into a bar fight.
A
Brendan
brawl.
and I, that is. It's going to get ugly. It's going to be fun.
At the Roadhouse. Get it, JD? It's called The Roadhouse.
The Roadhouse. This is the podcast.
The podcast.
The
at
podcast.
The Roadhouse.
Exactly.
Oh, gosh. This movie is so aware of itself, it's actually not aware of itself at all.
I know, exactly. And it's going to be a little bit weird, but when we get into the fight, I'm going to punch Brendan 4 different ways, and it'll look like I actually punched him in the face. Because that's how we do it now. That's the new way.
I don't know. It might look more like just random air punch me in the face if the movie that we saw is going to be any indication of that.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. We're, of course, going to get into the new Roadhouse. All of it's good. All of it's bad. Well, we'll talk about it. The one thing that's really interesting leading into this, and I did not realize this until about a week ago, is that Brendan and I both had never seen the 1989 Roadhouse.
I know. Seriously.
Until a week ago. Until we were prepping for this review.
Yeah.
And seeing the new film. So that was interesting. It's never really come up over the years. And I guess that's why neither of us have seen it.
Interestingly, and I wrote about this on my letterbox when I logged the 1989 film, is that I always saw this movie when I would go to video rental stores as a kid, whether it be Blockbuster or one of my smaller local chains. Like, I don't know if anyone grew up in the Kutztown, Pennsylvania area, but there's a store called Mega Video I always went to.
Yeah.
And every time I went to this particular genre or section, I would see a copy of Roadhouse there on VHS. And then near it, I'd probably see a version of like Cocktail, and then maybe something like, Footloose. And I always thought they were part of a trilogy because they used the same fonts.
Yeah.
Like this,
that 80s font aesthetic thing.
Yeah. And then, of course, finally seeing this movie Roadhouse from 1989. Yeah, they're not alike at all. This movie is its own wacky beast. It really is.
For sure. Yeah. We'll primarily be talking about the new film here, the 2024 Doug Liman movie. But as we go, I'm sure we'll incorporate some of our thoughts of the 89 film since it is fresh and new to us, since we both caught up with it. And it's interesting because it came out when I was 4 years old. So as a child, it was clearly never a part of my world. But once you become a teenager, you're aware of its cultural impact. It's a movie from the late 80s that has become a cult classic of sorts, I guess. I mean, it's a film you know of. You've heard of it. Patrick Swayze. Like it has this cult following that, has rendered a reputation of sorts. But I just had never really taken the time to watch it. And I feel like even in recent years, when you're browsing Amazon Prime or something to that effect, like I feel like I've seen it on there as something to rent. Like it's popped up on my feed. Oh, you recently watched Ghost. Maybe you should watch Roadhouse.
Yeah.
And I just have never taken the time to see it, even though I feel like I've seen it in my feed several times.
It certainly has that reputation. It's definitely one of those movies that seems to be one that people just ironically love. Like, because it is kind of one of those like so bad it's fun kind of movies. And I mean, it's not a great movie by definition of what we like to call a great movie, right? But it knows what it is, and it embraces both its charm and its silliness. And Swayze makes you believe that he knows his shit. So like and it's also directed by a guy whose first name is Rowdy. So and the movie itself is exactly
Gotta love
that. It's
that.
like, yeah, I love that as well. So like the movie knows what it is. And I
Yeah.
kind of ironically and unironically loved it for
Yeah.
those reasons.
I mean, I think, and maybe this is appropriate because we're going to get into it this weekend on the main show, but I do think there is genuine love to be had toward that 89 Roadhouse in the same way someone could love Michael Bay. Because Michael Bay is a filmmaker that, say what you will about him, he has a visual style, an ethos, an eye for cinema that makes his films compelling visually. There is depth to the imagery. You know, he will use color sometimes in an interesting way. Certainly not like a Wes Anderson, but his films do pop in a way that I do find interesting. And Michael Bay knows the kind of filmmaker he is. He's not going to make an Oscar drama. That's not who he is. And Roadhouse, for me, carries that same ethos.
Knows what it is. Yep.
It's otherworldly. It knows what it is. It really leans into it and has a lot of fun. Yeah. And never really sways from its convictions.
No, and it's
to
certainly
me, that's what makes it great.
It commits to what it's trying to go for. And there is like like the sense of place with that movie, I think, is also well done as well. It has like an ugly, kind of dilapidated, kind of rural, in the middle of like middle America kind of vibe to it. So it actually renders some weird believability to this kind of world, as rowdy and silly as it is. So like it's definitely committed to itself, and you have to always applaud a movie for doing that.
No, I agree, and that leads us to the 2024 Roadhouse, which is directed by Doug Liman, and it stars Jake Gyllenhaal. The film also stars Jessica Williams. Conor McGregor is in the movie. And, a bunch of others that come and go throughout.
Yeah.
If you're not familiar with Roadhouse, you're probably not listening to this. But
For
just
sure.
in case, an ex-UFC fighter, his name is Dalton, in case you didn't know. He takes a job as a bouncer at a Florida Keys, here it is, Roadhouse, only to discover that this paradise is not at all what it seems. Okay.
That was epic,
Well,
Judy. That was epic.
Appreciate it. We gave a brief thought on that 1989 Roadhouse. Brendan, what did you think about this remake, this 2024 version of Roadhouse?
Yeah, I hated this movie. I'm not trying to be fun or even silly with it. I genuinely hated this movie. I when we were on episode 579 just this past weekend, GD, we sort of gave some brief, I guess, allusions to how we feel about this movie when we plugged that this review was coming. And I sort of jokingly said it's one of the worst movies I've ever seen. And I never like to make hyperbolic statements like that. And I don't even know if I genuinely believe that, but I do genuinely believe that it's my least favorite Doug Liman film that I've seen so far. And that includes movies like Jumper. I'd take that over this. I think the problem I have with this is we're going to talk a lot about what this movie is attempting to do, the experimentation of it. It's inventing new technology, and we'll certainly talk about how it's trying to utilize that technology for these fight sequences. And I mean, just to get straight to the point, it's technology that could be interesting in time. It's certainly not ready yet, based on what we see in this movie. And that's really not the problem I have with the movie, but it is sort of related to it. I just think this is one of the most misguidedly juvenile and aesthetically displeasing films that I've seen in a long time. This reminded me of like a little kid discovering Instagram for the first time. And in a weird way, that kind of sounds like it could be like so bad it's fun. Like it's such a fascinating failure. The reason I hate this film so much is that for how much juvenile energy this movie has, it has no ounce of personality. It doesn't. I have never seen Jake Gyllenhaal this checked out of a movie before. And he is someone that usually commits to everything he's in, good or bad. And here he's certainly committed to the physique of Dalton, but he didn't commit to, actually giving a performance of any kind. It's, and I don't really think anyone does. Like, somehow this movie has such a juvenile energy and it's amped up so much that it just feels numbing 3 minutes in, and it doesn't build to anything after that for me. So it just leads to a kind of a nothing movie, which for a movie like this that's meant to have some type of personality, that's the worst thing you could say. It goes back to why I hate movies like many of the last DCEU films, because they're the equivalent of hot air. Like, you might see worse movies from a technical standpoint in the year, but these movies are the most forgettable. And I think that's the worst thing you could say about any movie like this that fits into this kind of blockbuster genre, if you want to call it that. So yeah, that it does not work for me. It really did not work for me.
Yeah, I think that is very fair. And you make a lot of great points. I think this film misses in the same way that the new Ghostbusters films have failed. That 1984 Ghostbusters was irreverent. It was unfettered. It was goofy. It was not sentimental or rigid or reliant on dramatic urgency. Afterlife and Frozen Empire missed that tone entirely. This film is guilty of the same thing, between rewriting Dalton's backstory to ground him in some sort of familiar modern day realism and inventing a new fight choreography to enhance that so-called realism. It rejects the nucleus of what made that 89 Roadhouse so incredibly fun, because there isn't an ounce of grounded sincerity in that original film. It's so absurd and ridiculous. I mean, Dalton's quote unquote tragic backstory in that 89 Roadhouse is hilariously rooted in him tearing out the throat of a guy. But this is a film that wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to be silly and demented while also having enough recognizable pity to manufacture some sort of emotion. And the results are borderline unwatchable at times. It's extremely tedious. And look, I'm not saying that a remake should be verbatim the same as its predecessor. There should be changes and new artistic vision. But if you're going to if you're not going to adhere to the original nucleus, what's the point of the adaptation? Just use it as an influence and create something original. This last week on the main show, a film that I talked about briefly, the Kevin Costner film Waterworld.
Yeah.
That is a film that could have been a remake of The Road Warrior. It could have just been a remake, but on the seas. But no, they simply took inspiration and created something quote unquote new out of it. This film probably should have done that given the route it wants to go, because what made Roadhouse is just simply not at all here. It has no conviction. It doesn't show any reverence to its predecessor. And I'm with you. I think it's a complete misfire.
Yeah, I don't need it to be the same as you're talking about. In fact, I'd say the best thing about this movie is that it is not like its predecessor. But I don't know if that's intentional. It almost feels like an accident because, this movie wants to have its cake and eat it too, like you're talking about, this new one specifically. It is trying to ground Dalton into a new type of character. It's not Swayze playing this role anymore.
No.
It's Jake Gyllenhaal, who is a very talented actor. If they wanted to make Dalton someone to pity and feel bad for here, Gyllenhaal's the actor that could make that work.
Sure.
Yet somehow he feels so checked out. Like honestly, it's like whatever the goal of this movie was never communicated to him. And that's it feels like that from pretty much everyone in this movie. I even some of the villains who kind of have this cartoonish kind of vibe to it, which only conflates or confuses with the tone even further. Just goes to show how much of a mess this movie is. And another big problem I had with it too is, and this is why I wanted to reference how that first Roadhouse sort of took place in almost like a middle America kind of rural setting. Like it felt like if there's going to be a bar that has a rowdy reputation, it makes sense to do it there. It makes no sense to regurgitate that same plot in the Florida Keys. It does not make sense to me.
I don't know, Brendan. Have you been to Florida? There
Yeah, I
are
have.
some crazy mofos that live here. And
Is it believable that the cops would never show up?
Can I plead the fifth? I don't know if the
Have
cops
you-
are listening. I plead the fifth.
Well, I will say this. Okay, then let me get a little bit more detailed. Then maybe it's not so much the Florida problem of it all. It's how beautiful this bar looks in this movie. This specific roadhouse, like it looks so clean and pristine that to carry this kind of rowdy reputation that it's still going for, that doesn't fit for me. So maybe it's
the
more
grungy
so that,
look of the '89 Roadhouse.
well, that
feels
made
like
sense.
A place
That made
where
sense.
that
Yeah.
kind of stuff happens all the time. Yeah.
The Roadhouse here, and it's called the Roadhouse, which is a terrible joke that we referenced earlier, but that is actually a joke in the movie that does not land. But the Roadhouse in this movie looks like a place that would be attached to a 5-star hotel. Like it looks so grand and important and big and rich, and like I found some of that hard to believe personally, but that's the least of the film's problems. The biggest problem here is really just, as we're talking about, it comes down to tone, it comes down to commitment, it comes down to just the fact that the filmmaking here is such a misguided mess. I have no words for it. I really don't. I'm kind of flabbergasted at how juvenile that this thing is. It doesn't feel like it comes from the mind of an experienced filmmaker, let alone someone that's been making films since the 90s. It does not ring true to that at all.
No, I completely agree. The film is really vacuous in how it taps into what Roadhouse is. It's as if they didn't even watch the movie in preparation, the '89 movie that is, especially when you look at Dalton and how they rearrange him here.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm judging too harshly through the prism of '89. I don't know. But Dalton in that '89 film was both hyper romantic and hyper violent in a movie that was hyper excessive.
Yeah.
And here they strip him down to this UFC fighter that clearly struggles with some sort of guilt and remorse, which is a little part of Dalton in that '89 film.
Yeah.
So while he obviously finds himself in situations where he has to get violent, in this film, there are just no convictions to the character. He's just a name that some people recognize, which was supposed to be a motif used to scare people away. But even that is abandoned after the first 20 minutes of the film. The thing that is defining to him as a character barely holds any weight to his actions over the course of the movie. And you couple that with how much less sizzle the romance is here comparatively, again, falling more in line with this film's grounded sensibilities. And Dalton just seems to have no identity here. Nothing motivating him, nothing that resembles what the character is supposed to be.
Yeah.
Especially the Zen pacifist ethos that comes with the '89 Dalton. They try to infuse that ideology into Dalton a little bit in this film, and it is very clearly manufactured. Again, the film just wants to have its cake and eat it too. It desperately wants to be Roadhouse while equally wanting to be something new and modern. And I think it just needed to pick a lane. If you embrace the UFC stuff and just make Dalton a lunatic who loves violence, partially as a punishment to himself because of his guilt, that could have worked. But that's not what they do. They want to be Roadhouse, but be something that's completely different. And as a result, the tone is all over the place. It is a bewildering experience.
And you mentioned a word there that I think is so apt, and that's sizzle. This movie, and that can mean anything. Like this movie needed to sizzle. And for a movie with these types of fight choreographies and the way the camera moves, it has such an energy that the final product lacks any kind of sizzle. That's why I hated it so much. And I guess we need to talk a little bit more about the fight choreography here, because we've talked about this a little bit, that there was, and you might be able to speak to this a little bit more. I think you did more research on it, but there's a new technology that's being invented for this to try to make the fight sequences look as visceral as possible, to try and capture as much of it in camera, where there's like, it's basically like this weird form of superimposing someone else onto like a green screen environment that then gets mashed together or something like that. I don't know all the technical jargon around it, but it's a way to try to mash the two together so that way we have more single long takes of people getting hit and hitting each other, and you don't have to worry about edits to mask it, which is, it's not a bad idea. And I'm sure that'll get perfected years down the line, which makes this movie more of an experiment than anything else. The problem I have with all of it is not even the idea of the experiment. It's the camera movements. It's Henry Brom's cinematography, which just doesn't stop. And I'm doing this on YouTube for those watching. It just doesn't stop zigzagging here. And that just like, I'm just sitting here like, stop moving the goddamn camera. It's like, if you have this idea you want to try and experiment with, you're masking it with other things and you're just creating the wrong kind of energy.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest problem for me, honestly.
I agree. What they've been dubbing it is the 4-pass process. I'm not sure if that's the technical term, but that's what Jake Gyllenhaal keeps referring to it as. Okay. And essentially what it is so there's 4 different shots involved. The first one is the conventional Hollywood pass where you throw the punch and the other actor reacts to it without getting hit, which we've seen
many times,
a bajillion times over the course of history. Then there's a pass where they are hitting a pad. It's a CGI pad that is in lieu of the actor's face. Yeah. So they're hitting the pad at full speed. Then there's another pass of them getting hit with the pad at full speed. Yeah. And then there's a version with the 2 actors, I believe, or at the very least, the one throwing the punch, where it's in slow motion. So they're doing it in slow motion, connecting and reacting that way. So you have those 4 different passes that they then fuse together in the final product. Yeah. And that idea over time could be interesting. I agree with you. Because it's not perfected, it's really bad here.
It looks so awkward. Really it is so awkward.
It's not great. But even if it was perfected, I would still argue it's the wrong approach here because it angles the film toward realism, which is a far cry from the hyper excessive otherworldly absurdity that is the 89 film. Every fight sequence takes me out of the film. It almost feels like the visuals you would see in the Polar Express. That's how bad it is. Okay. To give it some context.
You know a fight in a movie is not working when you don't wince once while watching it.
It's not great, but the effect is to enhance realism because you're actually seeing them connect in the face, which obviously they don't do in movies to protect the actors and the stunt workers. So this is a remedy. This is meant to invite us into the fight as if we're watching a UFC fighter, as we would in real life. But again, Roadhouse, the 89 Roadhouse is anything but built-in realism. It is extremely
I thought it was a documentary.
Excessive.
What are you about?
It is so insanely over the top. It's a wonderful stylistic version of what it is. And I think it's really fun. And again, I'm not saying that this film needs to regurgitate that same style and to be the same movie, but commit to a lane. Either be hyper excessive or be grounded. You can't have both. And this film wants to be both.
Well, and weirdly,
I just don't. To me, that's partially why the fight choreography doesn't work here. Aside from just how wonky it is in terms of the technological component, but what do you want to be? Do you want to be stylistic and over the top as much of this tries to be, or do you want it to be something grounded that we can relate with? I like that tug of war here is
it's
extremely
fascinating.
tedious.
It's fascinating because I wonder how much of that tug of war is a byproduct of just how much the fight sequences are such failures here. Because to go for that kind of effect that we're talking about, you would think, okay, they're going for realism, but it's so early in the technological process to get it right that it inadvertently maybe comes off as goofy. And then you've got these zany camera movements here to emphasize the zaniness of it, which then conflates the tone even further. It's like it's hard to tell where the director's choice is the problem versus the accidental after effect of the visuals themselves. Like it weirdly reminds me of like imagine if you were to add some realistic brutality to those long take fights that Matthew Vaughn is known for. Let's look at the church scene, for instance, from Kingsman. Take away all the guns and just add physical brute force to it, and that's it. It would seem really awkward with the way the camera moves and follows everything around. And that's more or less how this entire movie feels to me. The camera just doesn't stop moving, and it conflates the tone even further. So it just adds to the failure of it all. I did not like this movie.
I agree. The camera work is also quite wonky as well. And also the performances. You talked about Jake Gyllenhaal. I want to speak to him as well.
Yeah.
But I also thought of Billy Magnuson here as Ben, who is our central antagonist. It does feel at times as if he's stuck between those two worlds. He heightens his performance to a degree, but it's as if he is not sure how heightened he should go. Like he it's like he's trying to battle that duality. Like, how zany do I go here?
Yeah.
Do I need to keep it grounded to some degree? Like, it feels like he's fighting that in every scene that he's in.
Yeah, it's
And
like he seemed confused. Which is unfortunate because I love everyone in this movie as far as them being actors. And like I think they've done great work in the past. Jessica Williams, who I also love, I think is she's just another one here that's really there to basically give us exposition. Is basically all she's here for.
A few comedic lines.
Yeah, and some of them land because she just knows what good comedic timing is, as we've seen before in other movies. But yeah, like Billy Magnuson is. You could tell it's almost like he's getting two completely different directional opportunities.
Exactly.
He's trying to do them both simultaneously.
And maybe that's in the editing where they gave him one take to be a lunatic and over the top, and then another take to be a little bit more grounded, and they try to fuse that in the editing room. That's kind of how it feels. Same thing with a bunch of his henchmen that we see throughout the film.
Yeah.
And then there's Jake Gyllenhaal, who I love dearly, but I do agree with you. He doesn't do himself a whole lot of favors here. I do think, to be fair to him, much of it is the writing and the changes they make to Dalton because, again, they want to ground him and let him loose simultaneously. But I don't think Gyllenhaal finds solid ground here. Maybe that's appropriate since he lives on a boat. I don't know.
Yeah.
But they make him more of an a-hole in this film. He's devoid of charm. His sarcastic smirking is admittedly a little funny at times, but mostly I think he struggles to coexist with Doug Liman's weird tonal volatility. Yeah. So it could be the writing and the direction. That's likely I would say that's more of the culprit than Gyllenhaal, but his performance does leave something to be desired. And part of that could come through in how you articulated it earlier. Maybe he was checked out. Maybe he just didn't care all that much. Maybe he was
saw it as
also
an opportunity
frustrated by Doug Liman's volatility. I don't know.
I think he just saw it as an opportunity to get paid to go to the gym and get ripped. Is basically all.
Maybe that's what it is. Go to Puerto Rico, which is where I think they actually shot this. It's not the Keys. I can tell you that.
I think it was the Dominican Republic.
Dominican, yeah.
Yeah. So
I think there are a few establishing shots that I recognize as the Keys, but beyond that, it's very much not the Keys.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, it's a vacation. He saw.
Then it might as well just be an Adam Sandler movie in that case because he likes to take his friends to vacation spots and make a bad movie.
Yeah.
What did you think of Conor McGregor?
Well, here's what's interesting, right? Because initially I found his performance here to be ludicrous, but upon reflection, he might have been the only one involved that actually took the time to watch the 89 Roadhouse and understand what movie that actually is.
Which is what makes his performance for me so great, but also so bad.
Yeah,
Because,
exactly.
yeah, it's like, okay, he's at least committing to something unlike everyone else, but is it the right kind of commitment given what Doug Liman and co are doing? And that's and that's where I'm not sure.
Yeah. If you took that performance and you just throw it into the 89 movie, it coexists
Kind of works.
with that film fairly well. It still might be a little unhinged and a little more over the top than even what the 89 Roadhouse is, but it fits more there than it does in this film. So at least, if I'm going to give him credit, he might have been the only one to do the homework.
He's
Be like, I watched the 89 film. That's nuts. I see Patrick Swayze's ass in that movie. I'm going to do the same thing. It feels like he's the only one that did the homework. Unless Doug Liman was like, hey, look, we want to channel Roadhouse, but we're also going to change it up tonally. And then he just did not tell Conor McGregor that.
Yeah, that's the thing. Because of that final product that we have here, it feels like Conor McGregor is in a completely different movie.
Very, very different movie.
I will say this, like, given his overall energy and what he does here, because this is his first ever acting role, I'd love to see him again in a movie that actually matches his approach. Because I think it might be fun.
He could be a good Bond henchman, like a Bond villain henchman.
Mm-hmm.
I could see him like the way Dave Bautista was in a few of the. I think it was Dave Bautista, right? And some of the.
Yeah. Oh yeah. He was in Spectre.
Spectre. Yeah.
Yeah.
I could see him in that kind of a role. If you tone back the energy a little bit, but I could see him.
Or don't. Maybe we need a Bond film with that kind of energy.
Maybe. I agree. Like, weirdly, why it doesn't work for this movie because Doug Liman is. I don't know what he's doing. It's puzzling. And I like Doug Liman as a filmmaker on the whole. He's just
kind of a journeyman filmmaker, but when he hits, he's made some really good movies, though.
Yes, I agree. This just seems, again, it has no conviction. Conor McGregor at least is bringing a personality to a film that is otherwise repulsive in that department.
Yeah, it really is. There's one henchman here played by, I want to get his name right, Arturo Castro, who plays Mo, who's kind of like the young, he's the one that gets his arm broken in the first fight.
Yeah.
I feel like of anyone here, maybe it's the script allowing him to play this role. He finds the best balance between all of these tonal extremes, I think, because his delivery and his humor is kind of dry, that it doesn't oversell the humor and goofiness while also not underselling it simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
If there's one compliment I'll give this movie, it's not just his involvement, but it's that one opening gag after the first fight at the Roadhouse, and Gyllenhaal's just like, okay, I beat these guys up. I guess I'll take them to the hospital now. I think that's a pretty funny setup. And there are at least a few moments that deliver some potentially funny and interesting setups. They just don't deliver on them. That's the one where I thought, okay, you got really close to something clever. And I'll at least give it that. That's the one thing of praise here that I'll give them.
Very fair. Now that's very fair. I do think there is something interesting. The only joke that really worked for me is the gag in the car after he slapped the hell out of that first group there, that first night.
Mm-hmm.
And they get into the car and he's driving them to the hospital.
Yeah.
I did chuckle at that, but primarily it's a missed opportunity. And, because the one thing I did find admittedly also a little interesting, and forgive me, I'm not sure the character's name, but the relationship that Dalton has with the little girl at the store.
Oh, yeah. I'm looking it up now.
I'm trying
Charlie.
to remember
Her name's Charlie, played by Hannah Love Lanier.
Yeah. So that is interesting. Again, it tonally plays more into the groundedness of this film. So it's still very different than the nucleus of the 89 Roadhouse. But if the film simply committed to being, I guess, a more grounded, realistic, quote unquote, realistic version of that movie, and that relationship was the central ethos or the pathos of the film, then I think you really have something there. And you commit to the UFC bit. You commit to the violence a little bit more.
Yeah.
Then I think there's potential there, but because the film is a giant mess, as we've been talking about, I don't think that dynamic is fully realized in the ways that it could have been.
It's unfortunate that the dynamic between Dalton and Charlie there was potential, as you're saying, but it's really just there to keep reminding us that, hey, remember that original Roadhouse? It was kind of a Western, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it's and they're really playing into the meta components here, because you watch that original Roadhouse from 1989, you kind of follow it from a plotting standpoint. It's kind of insane how much it mirrors Unforgiven. It kind of is that movie in many ways, and ironically, Unforgiven came afterwards.
Like a year later or something, a few years later?
A year or two, I think it was, something like that. Or maybe 3 years, because I think Unforgiven was 1992.
92.
So it's still very close, but I'm not saying Clint Eastwood saw Roadhouse and decided to make his version of Roadhouse as a deconstruction.
That's the movie I'm going to make as my masterpiece. It was 92.
Because both movies still fit the mold of the traditional classic Western storytelling.
Yeah.
But with here, that relationship between Charlie and Dalton, it's just there to keep reminding us of that influence, rather than actually commit to something, of substance that it might be going for and doesn't quite get there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even if you are going to commit to this, having your cake and eat it too, I think what remedies this film, even though it still would have had its blemishes, aside from giving it a personality, I do think you have to inject it with some personality. I do agree with you there. But at its core, you have to give Dalton some sort of identity. Yeah. Give him conviction. Something that engages us with him, either psychologically, emotionally. Yeah, exactly. It is an extremely hollow character. And that is anything but what he is in the 89 film, especially with Patrick Swayze and the charm that he brings to it.
Yeah.
And, you can't keep your eyes away from him in that film. There is sizzle to that character. And there is absolutely nothing of interest with Dalton here. As much as I love Gyllenhaal. I do love him, but this character is extremely insipid in this film. It just, I don't know.
The whole movie
I don't
is.
know.
I think the whole movie is, and that's why I hate it so much.
Yeah. At any rate, I think that's all I have to offer.
I'm done.
Do you have any final thoughts?
No.
No, that's it.
I like to have final thoughts just to give every one of our conversations a sense of finality and something kind of conclusive, but I don't have the energy. I'm done.
Yeah, I agree. This was a confounding experience, and it doesn't feel like really anyone involved here was giving that much of an effort. It's phoned in. It's a phoned in effort all around. Except Conor McGregor. I'm still going to give him a little
credit. It's not phoned in. It might be the wrong movie, but it's at least not phoned in. I do have a question for you. Maybe this is a good way to tie things up a little bit. So Doug Liman, filmmaker here, he is kind of a journeyman when it comes to his filmography. He's definitely kind of a director for hire in many ways, but you could definitely sense some synergies in many of his films.
Mm-hmm.
What are your favorite films of his? And I haven't seen every single one of them, but I've seen most of them because I still think his three best films are his first three.
Okay. I don't know. Like I'm pretty big on that Firstborn movie. People knock it comparatively to the Greengrass films, but I think it's actually just as good. I think it's just as good.
It is semantics at this point. It is probably my least favorite of those three, but I still really like it. That is one of his first three films, I think. So when I say his first three are my favorite three, I think that should still be included. I want to double check.
Okay, so we're not including. I see here his first three are Getting In, Swingers, and Go.
Oh, okay. I have not seen Getting In. Okay, so then I'll say my favorite three are Born Identity, Go, and Swingers.
Okay. Then, okay, yeah. If it's Swingers, Go, and Born Identity, then yeah, I'm probably there with you. I do like Edge of Tomorrow. I don't think it's great, but I still really like it. And the same thing with American Made. I think it's pretty good.
I like that. I also think Mr. and Mrs. Smith is kind of fun.
Yeah. Jumper has its moments.
Jumper's a wonky movie. I feel like that's a movie that was certainly, hated at the time for probably the right reasons, but weirdly you kind of appreciate now, given the landscape of blockbusters nowadays. It makes that movie more interesting.
It is amazing how so many films from 20 years ago probably age better in hindsight, given the state of modern blockbusters. But
one of those movies, I guess.
Yeah. But like, that's what I'm saying. Like, a lot of these films I do enjoy. Not all of them, obviously, but like Swingers, Go, Born, really good. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, enjoyable. Edge of Tomorrow, enjoyable. American Made, enjoyable. Hopefully his next movie will come back to form. I don't know.
I hope
his
it's
next
not
movie is called
Roadhouse
The
2.
Instigators. I don't know much about it, but
oh yeah, okay. Don't know much about it either, but I'm curious.
But it stars Casey Affleck and I think Matt Damon, maybe Ben Affleck as well. Trying to look here. Okay, so The Instigators. A botched robbery causes two thieves to go on the run, dragging along one of their therapists in the process. So it is a heist thriller that stars Matt Damon, Casey Affleck, Hong Chow, Paul Walter Hauser, Michael Stuhlbarg, Ving Rhames, Jack Harlow, Ron Perlman. Okay, Roadhouse wasn't great, but honestly, I'm excited for that.
I mean, admittedly, if that's a script, I'm guessing Doug Liman didn't have a hand in the script, but if that's one of those scripts that
it is written by Casey Affleck and Chuck McLean.
Yeah, that sounds so clever and interesting. I kind of secretly wish it was directed by someone else.
Very fair. I don't know why they tapped Doug Liman to do it, but
maybe he was cheap.
Maybe that certainly could be it. I guess this is coming to Apple TV Plus. I don't know when. I don't know when this is coming out though. It doesn't really say here.
Okay.
But that is on the horizon. Filming began in Boston in March of last year, so it's probably coming out kind of soon. Maybe later on this year. I don't know.
All right. Well,
but
interesting
hey, look,
concept.
You got the Afflecks, you got Damon involved. That's a really great cast and intriguing premise. We'll see.
Yeah. Just hopefully it's a good movie.
Look, all I'm asking for at this point is like American Made territory. If it's that level of good and entertaining, that's fine. I will accept that.
I'll be okay with that. That's actually a pretty fun movie. I think American Made is slightly underrated. I think it's a pretty
I agree.
Movie.
I like it. I mean, if it gets to like Born Identity territory, then we're really cooking.
Well, I mean,
for Doug Liman anyway.
That's the thing. Like with this movie, Roadhouse specifically, it kind of seems like Doug Liman is trying to channel his Swingers and Go vibes again. Kind of like a more like a more contained kinetic energy as opposed to like a big overarching grand blockbuster kinetic energy. And it almost seems like he's trying to go smaller as he makes more films, and I hope he gets there, because it's almost like this push and pull between trying to go small but still going big, and that's the biggest problem here with Roadhouse. So hopefully he's able to keep things more contained going forward.
Well, and maybe that's why inventing or trying to experiment with this new technology for Roadhouse was probably the wrong place and time, because you are trying to go smaller. I know that Roadhouse is meant to be over the top and excessive, but I don't think that style, bringing in realistic, quote unquote, realistic fighting, I don't think is appropriate for that kind of tone, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
But it is a weird mismatch if you're going to your Swingers roots, but you're infusing that with Born Identity, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and Edge of Tomorrow type fight choreography.
Yeah.
Like I don't know if it needed to go that far.
Yeah.
I mean, because like there's obviously some big fights in that original Roadhouse, but it's not like overly complicated choreography. It's just dudes punching each other in the face.
Yeah. That's all you need. And weirdly, those hits are more visceral and entertaining if the characters delivering them are entertaining.
Yeah,
which they were in that movie.
I agree. Yeah. At any rate,
All right.
I guess those are our final thoughts on Roadhouse.
Yeah, we don't recommend it.
Yeah, do not recommend this movie at all. I did not enjoy it, but I very much did really like the 89 Roadhouse. So if you're like me
too.
If you're like Brennan and you haven't seen it, I would recommend the original.
I ironically and unironically love that movie.
I agree.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that said, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, please leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. We would love to know how you feel. If you're watching on YouTube, please like the channel, subscribe, all that fun stuff. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please subscribe there as well. Rate and review us. Really helps out the show quite a bit. So we really appreciate those that do that.
Yeah.
I think that's it, Brennan. Any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here?
Remember, JD, it's not the Roadhouse. It's called the Road House.
Yeah. So thanks for listening to the podcast.
Yep. Nice segue there. Nice segue.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of the humor, I don't understand. Like
It was puzzling. It was really puzzling.
it just doesn't. There's even that one moment where Gyllenhaal as Dalton kind of reacts to that guy there on the beach, and he's like trying to intimidate Dalton, and he's just like, ooh, kind of thing. Which, like, in a vacuum, I kind of admire that in Gyllenhaal's performance. I also feel like it's antithetical to the character. Like, it's just so weird.
It is,
like,
yeah.
They had no vision for Dalton in this film, it felt like.
They had no vision for anything.
Other than his physique. We just want you to be ripped on camera. Can you do that, Jake? Yes. Okay,
Hey.
that's as far as we got.
May have sold the movie, and that's all they needed, I guess.
That's all they needed. Because I think it's done fairly well streaming-wise, right? If I remember.
I didn't look up the numbers, but I think it has been, although Doug Liman would not be happy with those numbers because he wanted it to go to theaters. And I will give him at least some credit there, that despite the final product and what I hated about it, I could see why this maybe fit in a theatrical kind of setting. Because there is still like a bigness and an energy to it that would have fit with that. That wouldn't have made it better, or at least for me it wouldn't have. But
I agree.
I will say I at least sympathize with Doug Liman's frustrations there.
Yeah. So, according to Amazon, it is the biggest streaming debut with 50 million viewers.
Wow.
Of course, we don't know exactly what that means, but that's what Amazon says.
Yeah, like
So-
what's it comparing to make that call? Like I don't know what the like the frame of reference is.
I don't know. All I see here is that for Amazon, that's their biggest streaming debut for a new release that went straight to streaming, I believe, is the context there.
Okay. So
But maybe that's
okay.
that gives some credence to Doug Liman's frustrations then. It's hard to say though, because
It's hard to say if that would have translated to a box office hit as well.
I don't know if it would have though. I don't know.
Yeah.
So hard to say, but people are watching it on Amazon for whatever that's worth.
They are. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, thanks for listening, everybody. Stay tuned for the main show this weekend. It's going to be a lot of fun. We also have a review of Godzilla and Kong, Godzilla X Kong, rather, the new Empire / the Frozen Empire, as we joked.
Yeah, that's a better title. Yeah.
So go and check that out.
Kevin was on his game with that reference.
Yeah,
there.
that was great. I love that. So go and check out that review as well. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, what a sad movie.
The
So disappointing.
podcast. What a terrible